Everyone here to the Brentwood Church, so happy to see everyone here, so thankful you're here, especially our guests that are with us tonight. Very honored to have you with us, and I ask you to stick around at the end of service. If you have a few minutes, let us get to know you a little bit better. We'd love to do that, and please, especially to our guests, come back and be with us at any opportunity you have that you're in the area. Our next meeting will be on Sunday morning at 9 a.m. We'll meet here for Bible study. Love to have you join us for that if you're able to. In a moment, we'll introduce our speaker for the evening, and then after the conclusion of the lesson, we'll be led in a couple songs and a prayer as we close out the worship service later tonight. And tonight, we're happy to be continuing our summer series of lessons studying the miracles of Jesus. And this evening, we are so delighted to have Marty Broadwell with us to bring the lesson. Marty's been with us several times in recent years for our summer series, including last year in our virtual summer series, and we're so happy he could return to be with us, as he always does a great job. So thankful for that. As many of you know, Marty comes to us from the Atlanta area, from the Embry Hills congregation, where he preaches on occasion there, and also in other congregations across the country. So we want to welcome Brother Broadwell, thank him so much for coming to be back with us, and look forward to tonight's lesson titled, Such Great Faith.
Now, when Jesus heard it, he marveled, and he said to those who followed, truly, or amen in the Greek, I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. Such great faith. The words such great, even though there are two words in the English, are only one word in the Greek. At the risk of being foolish, I'll say it's tastudos or something like that. And it's actually a pronoun that often comes before a noun that intensifies that noun that follows it. In this case, faith, both the accusative faith. I've not seen such great, and that's that word. And we know that word. It means an extreme amount of something, or a long time of something, or many of something. And whatever it is, it modifies that thing. And so this centurion's faith, it's being described here, is such great. You know that word, and I'll give you some examples of that. I believe it was Philip who said, what are 5 loaves and 2 fishes among so many people? You recognize that. John, as he's concluding Jesus, the description of Jesus' ministry in John chapter 12, before the events of the last night and everything, he says, and though he had done so many signs among them, yet they did not believe. Jesus, in answering the disciples' question, show us the Father, you remember what he said? Have I been with you so long, and yet you don't know me? And he goes on to say, and you asked to see the Father. In the book of Hebrews, you probably recognize this verse. Seeing we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. It's just a common word, and you sense the idea that it's a large amount. And it may be over a long time, or it may be many of one thing, or it may be some large volume of something. But that's what Jesus used to describe the centurion's faith. What I'd like to do this evening is look at the centurion's faith. I think as you've done these sessions on the miracles, it's probably become clear that while the primary purpose, perhaps in the foreground of a miracle, is to show Jesus as the Messiah, right? Jesus said in John 10, if you don't believe me, at least believe the works that I... And so it's the basis of belief. Yes, that's true. But I think it's just for sure, as you've studied these miracles, you understand that the miracles themselves carry a message about the compassion of Jesus, or about the nature of the kingdom. And this miracle also carries a message of the character of believers. Jesus points our attention to the centurion as the purpose of the story. I have not seen such great faith, not even in Israel. And so he's turning and pointing us to this centurion, I think, to learn from the centurion in the process of this miracle unfolding. That's my premise this evening. You can maybe disagree with me afterward, but we're going to look at the centurion because I think Jesus was turning to those who followed the Jews and said, you need to learn from this man's faith. So what I want to do is I'm going to kind of zoom out and slowly work our way down to the details of this particular incident, which is recorded in two of the gospel accounts, Matthew and in Luke. And I want to understand where the miracle fits in the flow of those books. I want to understand where it fits in the 3 or however many years of Jesus' ministry. It's in the first, but how does it fit in this introductory section of Jesus' ministry? And I want to understand the characters, the centurion in particular, and then the context of the miracle that way. And when we're done, we'll look at the actual events and then make some application. I think I'm going to come up with 3 things. There probably are 17, but I'm going to come up with 3 things that I think characterize such great faith. Okay, you're with me? Maybe we can get it done in a timely manner. First of all, the context in Matthew chapter 8 and in Luke chapter 7, the 2 places where this miracle is recorded, I would say it's pretty clear that it's in the first year of Jesus' ministry. While all the events are not always in the exact same order in the Gospels, it is pretty clear from the way the crowds react, from where Jesus is, from the nature of the publicity that's generated, perhaps even the surprise. It's pretty clear that some of these are early in the ministry, and they are recorded fairly early in the books of Matthew and Luke. So I'm not depending completely on the chronology or the order in the record, but rather some of the details about the event itself. In Matthew's account, you remember the Sermon on the Mount occupies chapters 5 through 7 as a kind of an inaugural address. You know that. Well, back up 2 or 3 verses before the Sermon on the Mount, and Matthew records that Jesus went about preaching the gospel of the kingdom and healing all manner of diseases and all sicknesses. And so there's a pair there, the teaching and the miracles. And that sets a rhythm going forward in Matthew. So there's the Sermon on the Mount, and then chapters 8 and 9 are just a collection, one after the other, of miracles, and that's where this miracle occurs. And then chapter 10, the limited commission, another fairly long discourse, and that pattern repeats 2 more times in the book of Matthew. All right, so we're actually in the second part of this statement, preaching the gospel of the kingdom and healing all manner of diseases and sicknesses. You see that? So we're following that rhythm. So right after the Sermon on the Mount is when this miracle occurs, except there's one in between. And it's the miracle of the healing of the leper. Not the 10, remember the one to Samaritan, not those. One leper who said, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." You remember that? And do you remember the most touching element of that? That was going to be a joke. And that is Jesus touched the leper, right? But Jesus said, when he said, "If you are willing," Jesus said, "I am willing." Okay? That's the miracle that comes just before this healing of the centurion's servant, which we'll cover tonight. But remember that. And remember, too, the outstanding action of Jesus to touch this man who was unclean. And that plays into the fact, I think, similar to the fact the centurion himself is a Gentile. And there was some stigma associated with Jesus' association with him. And that plays into the story. So see, those are 2 similar elements in the first 2 miracles after the Sermon on the Mount in the book of Matthew. It's also, this miracle we're covering tonight is just before the healing of Jesus, of Peter's wife's mother. Isn't that a mother-in-law? But anyway, the version says Peter's wife's mother. Right, and then after that, just a flood of people who find out Jesus is there, and he's in the healing business, and so they bring lots of people on into the night. You may remember that story in the book of Matthew, and that is what immediately follows this. It's also recorded in Luke. Now, in the case of Luke, it doesn't follow the Sermon on the Mount. It follows the Sermon on the Plain immediately, right after the Sermon on the Plain. So there is this pairing of teaching followed by miracle, even in the book of Luke. Maybe the Sermon on the Plain is the same as the Sermon on the Mount. I don't know. I don't think it is, but even if it is, it's very similar in terms of the timing. The other thing that's interesting, might play into the sermon, it might not, and that is the miracle following this is in a different city, and it's the first example of Jesus raising someone from the dead in the widow of Nain's son. And you probably remember later there will be, Lazarus is the last one, and the one in the middle, I can never recall. Oh, it's Jairus' daughter. So Jairus' daughter and then Lazarus, and those are the 3 resurrection miracles of Jesus. But the first of those immediately follows this miracle. Maybe that'll be relevant. I don't know. It's interesting, isn't it? I hope these kinds of facts are interesting to you too. The miracle occurs in Capernaum, and what I'm going to do here is talk about the significance of Capernaum and what had happened in Capernaum, best we can tell, before this particular encounter of the centurion with Jesus. You remember that especially at the early part, Jesus had established his home base and maybe even his home. The Greek word in Mark chapter 2 verse 1, this is the beginning of the incident where the paralytic was lowered through the roof. You remember that? The roof of the house. Those Greek words in chapter 2 verse 1 of Mark could indicate that Jesus was at home. That's a reasonable way to translate that. So whether it was rented or hired or maybe he was a guest for a long time, Capernaum was his home base. He had been there a while, and several significant things had already happened, the best we can tell, before this miracle. All right, and I want to look at those because I think they play into the story as well. The first is that in the synagogue in Capernaum, Jesus had cast out a demon of a man. And there was some excitement about the way the demon came out, and the demon called out and confessed Jesus' divinity and so on in the process of casting it out. But at the end of that, it says that the reports of that went into every place of the region. Again, looking like an early section of Jesus' ministry, because now the reports are new. They're new news, and this is surprising everyone from Capernaum all around. Okay? Second thing that's happened there related to that is that story I mentioned earlier about the paralytic who was lowered down through the roof. We know that story. I don't know why it's so easy to picture, you know, the roof opening up and some guy coming down. But you remember on that occasion, Jesus did not heal the man first. He said, your sins are forgiven. And then the air went out of the room as all the scribes and Pharisees inhaled together, right? How could he do that? And they reasoned in their hearts. They didn't say it out loud. You read that carefully, right? They hadn't come to quite the open opposition yet, early in the ministry, but they reasoned in their hearts. And of course, Jesus knew what there was in their hearts, and he answers their question, their unasked question, with his statement, you know, which is easier to do, say, man's sins are forgiven, or to say, take up your bed and go home, which is what he did say, and the man did that. That happened in Capernaum, as I mentioned before, maybe in the very home where Jesus was staying. And finally, there's another incident that John records in John chapter 4, and it's labeled by John as the second sign that Jesus did having come out of Judea. So I don't think that means it's the second miracle he ever did, but it does appear to be one of the earliest things he ever did in the region of Galilee. You see that? I think that's probably true of the water to wine miracle. It may not have been the first, but it's the first he did having come out of Judea. I believe that's the way to read the text there. But it might have been the first. I'm not going to argue that. That's not important. But it was early, right? John 4 is pretty early, especially with regard to the Galilean ministry in the first year. And in that incident, Jesus is not at Capernaum, he's in Cana. And a nobleman, apparently who lived in Capernaum, came all the way to Cana to find Jesus because his son was sick. Now, these two incidents are often conflated. And sometimes you might even hear me, I may have already done it, said the centurion's son. No, it's the centurion's slave, servant, or it's the nobleman's son. These miracles seem similar, and I think sometimes to skeptics, they like to say, well, see, John was all mixed up. He got all the details wrong, right? Having written at a different time, and it's, you know, in a different place and all that. No, it's a different incident altogether. And there are almost some opposites about John's account of this versus the centurion's servant. And I'll point some of those out so as we go through you can see that distinction. Some of them are significant even to our message tonight. It was a nobleman, not a centurion. The nobleman was probably someone in the higher or in the office or in the administration under Herod. He was a Jew, right? Maybe high up. And yes, from Capernaum, but he was not a centurion or a Gentile. He met Jesus in Cana, not in Capernaum, where our miracle tonight occurs. And he asked to talk to Jesus concerning his son, who was back home in Capernaum. In that incident, Jesus rebukes the man and the crowds for their lack of faith. It's an interesting opposite. In this miracle we're looking at, he praises the centurion in front of others. He says, how long can I bear with this? This generation seeks for a sign. Twice in the encounter, the nobleman says to Jesus, please come to my house and heal my son. And you'll see in the story of the centurion just the opposite happens. He does not want Jesus to come to his house. In fact, on a second occasion has to intervene to prevent Jesus from coming to his house, though he was willing to come to his house. And it seems, too, that the Jesus' refusal to come to his house was somewhat of a test of faith of the nobleman. He did finally just go home. And when he got home, he found his son had been healed, and it says, and then he believed with all of his house. You see, so there's a kind of reversal here. He had to go and do what Jesus said in order to produce the belief, whereas in this case, this centurion believed, it appears, even well before the incident occurred. You see the differences there. So, yes, they're similar, but they're not the same incident. However, do you reckon that a centurion who was wealthy enough to have servants and to pay for a synagogue in Capernaum might have known a nobleman in the hire of Herod, right, who was also from Capernaum? Is that possible? Is it possible that, given this occurred so early, that centurion might have actually heard the story, at least, if not interviewed the man himself about that miracle? Just a proposal, but I'm telling you all three of these events that I've described here represent background information that the centurion could work with if he was interested. If he was open-minded, he could work with to establish some level of faith on his part. Do you agree with me on that? Right? Now, the only thing shaky about that argument is, did all these things occur before the incident? And I think I'm on pretty firm ground there. At least one of them or two of them did. I think all three. But I'm telling you, we come into the story with this having occurred in Capernaum, where the centurion was kind of in charge. And I doubt if many things happened that escaped his notice. You see where I'm going with this? Okay, that's background. I want to talk about centurions for a minute. Does anybody want to guess how many men were under him? Yeah, so the name comes from 100 men, but the actual fact is, and if you've ever been in the military, you're hardly ever at full fighting force strength, are you? If a platoon's supposed to have, and I don't know, I make up a number, 40, you're usually running around 30. At least that's the experience I'm hearing from. You know, and so, yes, 100 was kind of the typical, but it was more of a name. Sometimes it was more like 60 or 80, and 6 of those made a cohort. And even within the cohort, there were various centuries, that's the group of men, that had priority or had rank over the other centuries. You know what I mean? And so the centurion who managed them might have a little higher rank over other centurions. Centurions, if you look at the Bible record of interactions with Jesus or with the early church, I would almost assert they're all good. Maybe you can show me a counterexample, but I'll go through these. You know who some of them are. Several times in the book of Matthew, the voice of God declares, "This is my son," and Peter says, "You're the Christ, the Son of God." But you know the last person who says this is likely the Son of God is a centurion. At the cross, he probably had something to do with that crucifixion. And yet when he saw the events and he saw that man, which you wouldn't think, looking at the body of Jesus on the cross, your first thought would be, this is the Son of God. But he came to that conclusion based on all the events surrounding it, and I think also the character of Jesus during the crucifixion itself. Speaks highly of the centurion and his open-mindedness. Y'all all know Cornelius, don't you? Boy, he's just the best guy you can imagine. Devout, feared God, gave alms, prayed always. That's how he's introduced. This is not after he became a Christian. This is before. There in Acts chapter 8, there was a centurion who intervened when Paul was about to be beaten. I think maybe the beatings had kind of almost started in Jerusalem. After the third journey, Paul appears in Jerusalem, and the Jews were just so angry. When he started his message, they started to beat him up. One of the centurions determined, Paul actually mentioned it, that Paul's a Roman citizen, and he jumped in and just saved his life. Said he went to the commander and said, "Hey, I think he's a Roman citizen." So they pulled him out and got him out of that dangerous situation. Kind of a courageous action. There was another centurion when Paul was imprisoned there in Jerusalem, who through a message from Paul's nephew, I think, found out that there was a plot against him, and that centurion made sure that Paul got safely out of Jerusalem and ended up in Caesarea. You remember those stories. You may not have known that centurions were involved, but they were. And then there's this fellow named Julius. I'm real impressed with Julius. He's named. And he's the guy that's assigned to Paul in Caesarea to take Paul to Rome. And it appears that he actually engaged the ship and arranged the transportation and traveled with him the whole way. On occasion, they had dialogue in which he disagreed with Paul. And later, in the shipwreck incident, the crew was going to throw the prisoners overboard to save themselves. That centurion stepped in and said, no, we're not doing that. He saved Paul's life, carried him all the way, and handed him over personally to the commander of the prison in Rome, Julius, I'm talking about. Y'all probably never heard of him. I think he deserves a character study. But anyway, handed him over to this, and it may be, if you read that verse carefully, that he kind of influenced things so that Paul could have his own hired house where the other prisoners apparently were not given that opportunity as they were delivered. And the fact that he's named, you know, I have this personal theory which has no evidence behind it except just my own desire for it to be true. And that is when the New Testament names people like Simon of Cyrene or Nicodemus or some of those others, that the reason it names them is because the people who are reading those books knew them because they were Christians. And I like to think that Julius, after having traveled with Paul and had all those adventures and seen Paul's character and delivered him to Rome himself, maybe even spent time guarding him in Rome, understood the gospel well enough to become a Christian. So, I like centurions. I just like centurions. And I think we will like the centurion we're going to meet tonight. They had to be over 30 years of age. They had to be able to read and write. They had to be recommended by someone of influence in the Roman culture and government. They had to have military experience. They had to be hardened to some extent by combat. And if they demonstrated valor in that military experience, they could be promoted or nominated early for that job. They had to be Roman citizens. They received higher pay by a good bit than the men under them. As a result of that, they had decent social status in a place like Caesarea. Now, it's clear the centurion was a representative of the Roman Empire, and part of his job would have been to keep order and keep track of the civil events in that place. It's been my experience in doing work where I've interacted with the military quite a bit. In fact, some higher-ranking people, colonels and generals, that once a man achieves or in order to achieve the status of commanding 100 or more men, there's almost a requirement to have a certain quality of character about that. You've led men, you realize the value of having to motivate them, to show your own integrity and honesty if you want them to trust you and follow them. That should be our experience. I'm not saying it's a universal rule, but I do think it's the case that men, even in the world, that rise to a place of respect like this, that's earned, okay? Political appointees like Herod or Festus or Agrippa, run away from them. Now, I'm not talking about them, Pilate, those guys. I'm talking about a centurion. And so I think we should maybe think of that. They could expect government employment in retirement and so a continuing income. They were often leaders in the community, as we'll see in this story. They often had non-Roman soldiers under them, another challenge of motivation and discipline probably. The reason was the Roman Empire could not adequately keep their thumb on all the territories they had conquered without the help of mercenaries, basically, that would come into the hire under a Roman citizen, centurion, or other officer. And this is an interesting thing. I think explains to some extent this servant of his, slave is another Greek word, doulos, here, and that is that veteran soldiers, as they aged out of being active duty, as we would say, they often continued in the hire of those men who led them when they were active. And so they would actually, as we know in Bible times, a person could volunteer, and it was often a very beneficial, mutually beneficial arrangement. They could volunteer to be slaves under a certain master. So that was often the case that a centurion, as he became more or less located, then he would have his former soldiers. If he was a good man, they would be under him. And so in this story, this man was dear to him. And I can just imagine some story related to how long this guy had served under him and seen the quality of a man he was and developed a relationship and so on. I'm trying to humanize these people. These were real people that lived in a real time that in many ways was difficult, in many ways was like our own, as we'll see. But they were real people with certain characters and characteristics that are important to know. This is a cartoon, so don't try to read it. But I wanted to note that in these two accounts there are significant differences. And it's caused, for those who want to be skeptical about the Bible record, there is some ammunition here in the two accounts, Matthew's account and Luke's account. And I've shown you here in the yellow on the left the parts of Matthew's account which are not in Luke's account. And I've shown you on the right in blue the parts in Luke's account that are not in Matthew's account. I'm going to assert to you right this minute that studying these two things has increased my faith in the inspiration of the Bible. These details fit together so well and they add so much to the story. Not only that, but I think it's so clear as you read them that the things that Matthew includes that Luke does not are essential to Matthew's account and his themes and his messages. I'll just tell you what's in the yellow if you look at the primary part of it, is that he records the fact that Jesus went on and kind of makes a reference to the book of Isaiah. Imagine Matthew quoting Old Testament, right? And describes a coming kingdom. Imagine Matthew talking about the kingdom of heaven. We just finished the Sermon on the Mount, right? And those are things that are unique to Matthew's account. I wonder why. Because that's a theme, and he's writing to Jews who know the Old Testament and so on. You see that. Now, Luke's account adds the fact that it wasn't the centurion himself, but some Jewish leaders that he enlisted to go as intermediaries on his behalf to talk to Jesus. And later, as Jesus was going to come to his house, Luke records, he got almost panicky and he said, no, I didn't mean for you to come to my house. And he sends some friends out to stop Jesus. And they had, now the words of interaction with Jesus are pretty much the same. In fact, in Luke's account, which is all done through intermediaries, Luke even records it this way. And when Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him. Almost like the man was standing in front, even though in Luke's account he isn't. But it's essentially the same thing. And it's even clear that the speeches of the Jewish leaders and the friends are well rehearsed. This is what I want you to say. They were speaking as, the mouthpieces of this man. Why would that be? Why would Luke indicate the separation of Jesus from this Gentile? If you're aware, one of the great themes in the book of Luke is the oppressed and the outsiders, right? So many rich characters that are women, for example, are presented. And lepers and Samaritans figure prominently in the book of Luke. You should know this. Luke is, in fact, I could go on and on about this, but starting with the Song of Mary, this idea of how the oppressed will be victorious. It's a theme in Luke that the outsiders will be exalted and accepted. And you see how that fits with what's described in Luke as different from Matthew. Rather than shaking my faith at all, I just think it had to be an eternal mind to fit these things together, covering both the themes as well as the facts of the story. And when we shuffled them together, what a wonderful story it turns out to be. And you're probably wondering at this point in the clock, when are you going to get to the story? So we'll do that now. I think I can't resist reading the two accounts. I just think we're going to do that. So let's turn to Matthew chapter 8. I'll begin with verse 5. If you want to follow along in the micro text here, you can, but if you'd open your Bible, it might be useful. Now, when Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, pleading with him, saying, Lord, my servant is lying at home, paralyzed and dreadfully tormented. Jesus said to him, I will come and heal him. That reminds me of the leper story right before this, where he says, I am willing, and he touched him. This seems very parallel. The centurion answered and said, Lord, I'm not worthy that you should come under my roof, but only speak a word and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man under authority, having soldiers under me. And I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard it, he marveled and said to those who followed, Assuredly, I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. And I say to you that many will come from east and west and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom will be cast out into outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then Jesus said to the centurion, Go your way, as you have believed, let it be done for you. And his servant was healed the same hour. Now Luke's account in Luke chapter 7. Begin with verse 1. Now when he concluded all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. And a certain centurion's servant, who was dear to him, was sick and ready to die. So when he heard about Jesus, he sent elders of the Jews to him, pleading with him to come and heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, they begged him earnestly, saying that the one for whom he should do this was deserving, quote, "For he loves our nation and has built us a synagogue." That very synagogue we talked about before. I wonder if he ever attended himself and listened to the reading of the prophet Isaiah and other things. I think he must have. Then Jesus went with them. And when he was already not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to him, saying to him, "Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof. Therefore I did not even think myself worthy to come to you. But say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man placed under authority, having soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes. To my servant, do this, and he does it." When Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him. That's what I talked about before. In the story, the friends are talking, but he marvels at the man as if they're having a specific direct conversation. And turned around and said to the crowd that followed him, "I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel." And those who were sent, returning to the house, found the servant well who had been sick. This is clearly the same story. And I will show you how these facts fit together in a combined story. First of all, a servant, and other Greek words used there are for boy and for slave. Boy doesn't mean necessarily young in this usage. It does mean someone in the family kind of and under the service of someone, but it's, I don't mean family literally, but I just mean in the household is what I meant to say. But anyway, he was dear to him, Luke says. And I followed the same scheme, by the way. Blue means it's in Luke, not in Matthew. White means in both. Okay, so you see how this fits together. Luke, the physician, says he's sick and ready to die. Matthew adds that he was paralyzed and dreadfully tormented, meaning, I think, in much pain. Paralyzed means he couldn't move. Remember an incident before this. They picked up that paralyzed man on a bed and carried him to the house and put him up on the roof, and that ain't going to happen with this guy. He's close to death. He's in agonizing pain. He cannot move. He can't be moved. Can't be moved. And so it's clear that that option is not available here. I would say he was more sick, maybe, than the man who was paralyzed, who seemed to be in fairly decent health, could interact with Jesus. In this case, this man, according to the physician, was ready to die. And so the centurion, in Luke's account, we learn that he enlists the Jewish elders of the town to go to Jesus. And he even has them explain for him, "I'm not just doing this because I'm lazy or I don't have time to come talk to you. I am not worthy to come to you." I hope to convince you of the significance of that statement when we get to the implications of what such great faith might mean to us. But he had them go for him on his behalf and say, "I'm not worthy to come personally to see you." And their request to Jesus, earnest request, was to come and heal the man. And I think the implication was they said come, but not necessarily come to the house, because later that's clearly not the plan the man had in mind. And so the elders in that process also assert, in Luke's account, the centurion's worthiness, not recorded in Matthew, but it's interesting that it's in Luke. And it's a works-based justification, isn't it? He's a good man. He loves our nation, which, by the way, is the right nation to love, right? And he built our synagogue. So he's a guy that really deserves some help. If any Gentile deserves it, he does, because of all that he's done. You see that? And they kind of justify Jesus' attention to this man that maybe, in their own thinking, would not deserve Jesus' attention. Jesus immediately, and this reminds me of "I am willing" in the previous miracle, says, "I will come and heal him." That's in Matthew's account. And Luke says he just went with them. Doesn't record that exact statement, but they go together. And when they were not far from the house, Luke records, the centurion apparently heard they were coming. That makes sense to me. You remember some other stories where Jesus is trying to get to Jairus' daughter, but the crowds are slowing him down. It's clear there's crowds here because he turns to the crowd to say what he says about the great faith and the prophecy and everything. So he's slowly making his way. Meanwhile, I think the friends go and say to the centurion, he's coming. He's coming. He's going to come to your house. And the centurion's thinking, as he had said already, I'm not worthy. I don't know. Here's what he says. I'm not worthy for you to come under my roof. Just say the word. And that's in both accounts. It seems to me that is a key theme, that there's a sense of worthiness of a Gentile. That's going to be a key message, I think, that we'll have to learn from this. And interesting, in both accounts, the centurion describes the reason that he believes Jesus does not need to come to his house. You got authority. I've seen that already. You don't need to be placed. And I'm thinking he might even remember the nobleman's son incident. That's all the way from Cana to Capernaum. That's a longer way, right? So look, I know how authority works. I don't follow my soldiers around and everything they do, I have to have my hand on them. They do what I say as a result of they do it remotely, you might think of it, as a result of my authority to do that. He put that together himself and felt so strongly about it, he stopped Jesus from coming to his house. And that's, I think, the point at which Jesus turns not to the friends, and although they heard it, because it says they left after he said it, but he turns to the Jews that are there, and he's kind of saying, look at this. I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel, he says, to those that are there. And then in Matthew's account, Jesus turns, and here's where I think the idea of these racial and ethnic differences is emphasized even more, is Jesus then has, he just prophesies. And I think it's clear he's alluding to a passage in Isaiah, which we'll look at. He prophesies of a feast where all the nations, and I'm interpolating feast, but all the nations come and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, with the patriarchs. And the sons of the kingdom are cast out, outer darkness, gnashing of teeth, all that. That's his prophecy, right? And then after he has his say that way, Luke records that Jesus says, go your way, Matthew, as you have believed, so let it be done. I like the wording of that. The thing you wanted, the thing you believed would happen, it will. And then both record that the servant was healed that very same hour. Okay, that's the story. You see how that fits together into a wonderful narrative? And I think seeing the details of the intermediaries, two different sets, and two different times the man states his unworthiness, they just add a richness to the story that we're going to learn from, I think, in this. So what is such great faith? I'm going to suggest three things that represent the centurion's great faith, which I think God also requires of us. I'll summarize them this way. One is a way of looking at the world around us that we live in, the world of men, the world of social relationships in particular. That's one. A second is a way of looking at ourselves and our own worthiness and whether we deserve what God would give us at all, or what we really deserve, we might say. So, the world around us, ourselves, and the third, of course, is our view of Jesus. What do we see in Him as we look at Him? And that's the three things we'll look at. It'll be more specific than that. But the first thing I would say is that the centurion himself was not deterred by worldly outsiderness. I learned in high school, if you put quotes around words, that means you're apologizing for them. And that's because I can't think of a better one. Or I think of some, but they have such social baggage associated with my... So outsiderness. Y'all know what I mean by that? He was on the outside looking in. He was a Gentile. He says that. Jesus says that. When he turned to the crowds and said, I've not seen such great faith. No, not even in Israel. What was he implying? This man isn't in Israel, right? So at the very outset, Jesus acknowledges his foreignness from the standpoint of the chosen nation, to use Moses' terminology. There's something backward here. Jesus didn't deny his outsiderness. He never said, oh no, you're really not a Gentile or something like that. And the other thing is, he didn't demand his rights or a remedy for that class separation. Or, he could have said, well, what do you mean I can't talk to? I'm a centurion. I'm a Roman citizen. I've given money to these people. I'm a good man. He could have argued that his access should have been allowed based on his own merit. We're going to get to that in the second point, of course. But he didn't demand anything. He didn't demand that Jesus accept him as well as a Jew or come to his house to prove that he would right, and to challenge him. He didn't say, you know, you need to address this racist society around us. In fact, I think we should have some demonstrations and fix the minds and attitudes of all these racist people around us. Maybe even pay some reparations for what's been done. He didn't do any of that. Why did he not do that? Was it not a real problem? I'm saying to you that it was a real problem. But I wonder if he had a bigger goal in his head than fixing that problem in that moment. You see what I mean? Yeah, he could have complained about, the way you guys treat Gentiles, so on. It didn't matter to him. He had something way more important that he was trying to accomplish. And so I think he was not deterred by the fact that he was an outsider from the standpoint of Jews, and we might even argue from the standpoint of access to the Messiah, whom I think he was concluding that Jesus probably was. He went even further than that. Living in this kind of unjust thing where he's a better guy than probably most of the Jews all around him, Jesus even says that, right? Even in that environment, he says to Jesus, I don't want to inconvenience you. I don't want you to come to my house because it might be a disservice to you. He wasn't even thinking of himself. He was thinking about the potential difficulty that it might cause Jesus to come to his house. Did that ever happen? That Jesus got in trouble for going to someone's house? Read the next chapter about the call of Matthew. Jesus goes to Matthew's house, and guess what they all said? He eats with publicans and sinners, right? So you know they're watching what Jesus does. They're watching where he goes. Interesting passage in Acts 11, and you need to look at that to kind of get the full force of that. You remember Peter going to another centurion's house. We talked about Cornelius. In Acts chapter 11 and verse 3, Peter is called on the carpet by the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem for going and eating and going into the house of a Gentile. Remember that? And so in chapter 11, he has to defend himself. Notice his defense. He's describing, No, that's right. In chapter 2. In verse 3, they're accusing him, saying, you went into an uncircumcised men and ate with them. But Peter explained it to them in order from the beginning, saying, I was in the city of Joppa in a vision and so on. And this is not the verse I wanted. I can quote it. I can't find it. Well, when Peter meets, here it is. It's chapter 10, verse 28. 28. He came, he went in, he found the many who had gathered in Cornelius' house. I apologize for this glitch here. But let's go ahead, 28. He said to them, you know how unlawful it is for a Jewish man to keep company with or go into one of another nation? But God has shown me that I should not call any man common or unclean. What does that imply that Peter would have called Cornelius before the vision? What would he have called him? Common or unclean? Can you imagine someone coming to the building here and they're at the door and we say, wait a minute, your accent's funny. Your skin color's different. Where did you come from? We think of you as common and unclean. And that's the way Peter would have thought of Cornelius, right? Before this vision, that was the point of the vision. I learned from this vision not to call anyone common or unclean. And so we have the centurion who recognizes that, recognizing the danger, the inconvenience if Jesus came to his house and ate with him. He said, I'm not even going to make you do that. We don't need to do that. I don't want it to happen. I'm not worthy and I don't want to inconvenience. And that's what he actually says. And so Jesus responds to that, and not only by saying such great faith, but then in Matthew's account he says, they will come. I picture a time, a kingdom where the nations will come from the east and the west and sit at feast, and I interpolate that in the kingdom. East and west, that's interesting. The first Gentiles that appear in the Matthew account are the Magi. Where do they come from? The east. Where does the centurion come from? He's from the west. In fact, best I can tell, he's the only white guy in the story. But anyway, he's there from the west. And so we've got east and west in Matthew meeting together in a kingdom that represents the unification of all nations. All nations are welcome to come to the feast that God prepares. And it's with the patriarchs. And I have to remember Galatians 3:7, which says, you're children of Abraham by faith. That's who the children of Abraham really are. It's those who believe, anybody who believes. That's the children of the sons, actually, of Abraham, the patriarchs. And I think in Jesus' statement about the kingdom, he is looking at Isaiah 24, in particular chapter 25, but let's take a little run up and see what that text is about. And again, I'm asserting that at least the Jewish people knew Isaiah well enough to know what this was about. And I think it's likely that even the centurion, when he heard it from his friends, knew what Jesus was getting at there too. Chapter 24 of Isaiah is a very dark, destructive chapter. It describes what looks like the destruction of the whole world. Of course, it's the end, I think, of the Jewish system of things. But in chapter 25, there's a turn and a positive picture of a rule that's set up in the midst of the destruction. And actually, at the end of 24, there's the hint, for the Lord of hosts, of armies, Yahweh of armies, will reign on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem before his elders gloriously. 25:6. And in this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all people a feast. So I think he's referring to. Now, what? For all people. Notice that. And you'll see again, choice pieces, feast of wine on the lees, of fat things full of marrow, of well-refined wine on the lees. And he will destroy on this mountain the surface of the covering cast over the people. I won't go into detail about that, but I think that represents a kind of a cloud, a hard shell, either representing that they're not in relationship with God, or they're in darkness, or in some measure they're outcast. And he's going to tear away that covering, that restriction that's cast over all the people, and the veil that is spread over all nations. I want you to know that last thing shown here, all nations, is the Hagoyim word, which is Gentiles. It's just the word Gentiles, and it's used that way in the Old Testament, often referring to the heathen nations, their idolatrous, abominable worship, and so on. But it's definitely for all the people. So Jesus is referring to this prophecy from Isaiah. I read somewhere that the Jewish people's idea of the feast that God would prepare is from Psalm 23. He prepares a table before me in the presence of my enemies, right? So the idea is just for the Jews, and they can trash talk those who didn't get invited to the feast in the presence of their enemies. This picture in Isaiah is the opposite of that. He's inviting everybody. And Jesus even adds, and the sons of the kingdom might be excluded from that. The second thing the man did, besides ignoring, in a sense, the state of the world around him, is that he acknowledged his own unworthiness. And you understand, the elders defended it, right? They came into the works-based story about what a good man he was, the works he had done, the faith that he had, and so on. He didn't mention any of that, right? He confesses his own unworthiness twice, to come to Jesus in the first place or to have him under his roof. And that's despite the fact that he was a really good man, as we've talked about, right? He was respected. He was wealthy. He was righteous. He was actually appealing to Jesus on behalf of someone else, of all things, in a generous way. He was a good man, but he doesn't say that. He confesses what we all have to confess, that we're unworthy. We are all unprofitable servants, and he understands that, to the extent that he does not even feel comfortable in the presence of Jesus. And you know, Jesus doesn't really deny his unworthiness, except to say he has great faith. He doesn't say, hey, don't beat yourself up, you're better. And you know, in our society, self-esteem is like thought to be the foundation of good mental health or something. I think it's maybe the opposite, especially in light of a holy God who has absolute knowledge of what we know and what we do and what our motives are. Boy, if you're aware of your own thoughts and other things, I think we should all feel that same unworthiness. Unworthy to come before the Master of the universe, before Jesus. But, despite his unworthiness, in a wonderful way, Jesus grants his request instantly, despite the fact that he probably was unworthy, as all of us would have been. All right, so the world, himself, he apprehended Jesus' authority and power. That's the third thing. He turned to the Master. And what did he see in Jesus? I picked the word apprehended. I worked with that one quite a while too. What I mean by that is he saw the riches of it, the extent of it, the whole thing. He could see the extent of Jesus' power over space, over time, over disease, no matter how close to death that servant was. He apprehended the depth and the power of Jesus' authority. And he even mentions the authority in his answer. he deduced that authority in its scope, I think, not a blind faith. He's not admired by Jesus because he just instantly flipped over and thought to himself, yeah, Jesus has got to be true because I need a solution to this servant problem I've got going on. It was not an unreasoned faith without evidence. He built it on what he had seen and known and had witness to him about Jesus' works. Do you see that? That's the same as everyone's faith as we begin to understand about Jesus. If you're struggling with your faith, that's what you got to look at. It isn't waiting for some feeling that comes along in an instant or in a crisis. That's the wrong time. He knew Jesus' earlier teaching, and he knew his miracles in Capernaum. I think I would assert that. And not only that, he also could match that with his own understanding of authority, which he does. And that is this: he knew this was the way authority works. And he saw no limits to Jesus' power over some distance. You don't need to come to my house. It doesn't matter how sick my servant is. In fact, I like that he says, just say the word. And that's kind of an interesting theme too, isn't it? The Word of God is kind of the same as something being so and happening. I don't know how to, they just go together. There's not one without the other. God spoke the universe into existence. The Word became flesh and those things. So he just said, say the word. And so in that, there's an interesting thing Jesus does. In the discussion of the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Does that sound familiar? Do you remember any other verse where Jesus brings up Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? That God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You remember that? Later, I think it's in Luke 20 and later Matthew 23 maybe. He's proving the resurrection from that passage. Remember that? They had that trumped up question about, I don't know, wives or something. And yeah, the reference to the patriarchs is Jesus saying, you know what? We're all going to be around in a feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who are alive. Who are alive. And not only that, look at this prophecy from Isaiah again. We got down to verse 7. He'll destroy on this mountain the surface of the covering over all the people, probably the curse of sin or ignorance, and the veil that spread over the nation. You know what the next verse says? He will swallow up death forever. Does that sound familiar? That's in 1 Corinthians 15. It has to do with, Paul makes a reference to that to say, this is the end of things, is that death is finally conquered. Oh, it's not just disease. It's not distance. It's not prejudice in the social system. It's death itself is swallowed up. And I think there's just no question that this prophecy was connected, especially with the reference to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the Lord will wipe away tears from all faces. And we kind of know the sense of that too. So yeah, this is not just about healing temporarily, because the servant probably died at some point. It's about conquering death. And so when he looked at Jesus' power over all these things, distance and everything, Jesus turns around and says, it's more than that. It's power over death. This kingdom that we have will be with the patriarchs, right? And this prophecy from Isaiah spans time and conquers death in the end, swallows death up in victory. And so he kind of returns more to the centurion than he asked for from the standpoint of information and promises. Such great faith. I'll summarize this way. Because he was not deterred by his exclusion in this world, he was invited to a heavenly feast. There's just a common theme in the Bible, and that is, with faith, what you think you want becomes something that you really need, not the little thing that we sometimes ask for. And I think I can kind of see that in this. He didn't get all messed up because there was prejudice in the society against him, or he got excluded, or he wasn't in the in crowd, or he wasn't popular, or he was opposed by his family, or any of those things. The Jews didn't accept him or whatever. Why? He had faith. And what was the result of that? He was invited to something way more important than just some kind of acceptance in this earth. Second, looking at himself, because he acknowledged the truth that he was unworthy, he was granted for free, instantly, what he really wanted, which was the saving of his servant's life. I think that's the case too for us. We have to acknowledge that we really don't deserve the gifts of God, but when we do, He gives us exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think. And we have to have faith to see that that's likely to be true. And finally, because he confessed Jesus' power and authority and apprehended it, really, to some extent, he was shown Jesus' power over even the last enemy, which has eternal consequences, the last enemy being death. I think that's what great faith is. And you see that he starts with a little. You have to give him credit. It's great faith, right? But he ends up with even more. Can you see that in this? And I think that's the other key thing about having some measure of faith, is that it gives us such great blessings that we grow from. And I couldn't help ending with this passage from Luke as well, same chapter in fact. Therefore take heed how you hear. It's like the next chapter. For whoever has, to him more will be given. And whoever does not have, even what he has, he seems to have, will be taken away from him. Luke 8 and 18. And I think that's our invitation. Do I do an invitation or I just quit? We're going to sing a song? Okay, then I can just quit. That's my lesson. That's the end of it. I hope you found the story of the centurion interesting and informative and motivational, so that we can follow his example to such great faith. Thank you.
I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. It's encouraging to see everyone out this evening. Marty, thank you once again for joining us and being a part of our summer series. Thank you for the lesson, which certainly does encourage and edify us from God's Word. Let's remember those who we need to be praying for this week. We heard that Bonnie Hope's surgery went well. We were glad to hear that, and I believe she hopes to go home tomorrow. So let's continue to remember Bonnie as she recovers. Mike Hunt is still at Vanderbilt. He will be there until Friday. Every day he's just apparently undergoing quite a bit of testing, as they're just trying to determine if there's anything they can do to help Mike or help others who are in Mike's situation. There's a lot of unknown about what's going on with Mike, so let's remember Mike. And then, of course, Darren Patton, who continues to recover at home. Eddie, is there any other update on Darren? Okay. So just keep Darren in your prayers as well. We'll sing 2 songs, and then Darrell Reeves will lead us in our closing prayer. I know whom I have believed. I know not by God's wondrous grace to me He hath made known, nor why unworthy Christ in love redeemed before His own. But I know whom I have believed in, and am persuaded that He is able to keep that which I commit
pray, please. Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for this opportunity to have another of our summer series lessons. And we're thankful for Brother Broadwell, who so ably and understandably brought a lot of light to something we've read over so many times, and has given us so many things that we can take home and reflect upon in our own lives. And just think about the fact that we can even pray to you as an individual and cut through everything between ourselves and you, have a direct conversation, and have the faith, hopefully, that when we lay our supplications down, if they're within your will, we know we will be heard. And we know, Lord, that you can act. We think about our world today, Lord, on a broad basis. Darkness swirls around. It's not at a distance. It's got a low ceiling. It's coming lower and lower into every aspect of our society's lives. We ask you to let us cut through this darkness. Let your word cut through this darkness and lift this darkness so that light will penetrate our people, our nation, our families, and each of us. And closer, as Wally has mentioned, those that are sick or in hospitals, we just pray their hand will be on LaDonna Duggar, on Mike Hunt, on Darren, and on Bonnie, and especially those that are providing care for them, their judgments, their wisdom, their thought processes, and their touch, that it would enable these four to soon take their place back here with us. And as we prepare to leave here, let us have a productive week in your service, and we thank you so much for all of our blessings and for all of those here as we love each other and depend on each other. In Christ's name, amen.